All right. Well, it's about time to get started. So I just want to kind of level set before I introduce myself, introduce kind of what we're going to be talking about. That, you know, I'm pretty much just a common plain speaker. I'm not going to try to wow you with anything. I'm just going to kind of have a conversation, and I'm going to try to leave some moments for some questions at the end, if there are some. And if they're telling me to move the mic closer, so I'll go ahead and follow instructions. But let me go ahead and get started. I just want to introduce myself real quick. My name is David Morimano. I'm from the United States. I've been in this space, cybersecurity space, for a little more than 20 years. Most of those years have been very focused in identity and every spectrum of identity, whether it's IGA, PAM, cloud infrastructure entitlements management, access controls, kind of the whole gambit. So after this presentation, if you've got any questions on anything that's relevant to those areas, I'm happy to help. Who I'm here with is Grabowski. Grabowski, as well as Integral Partners, who's listed there on the screen, are leaders in the digital identity space. Zalient made an acquisition of both of those companies to well-round what we call kind of our zero trust process and approach. And I'm going to be talking to you about that a little bit because I think I look at it a little bit differently than probably most vendors and most people trying to sell you product or sell you something. That's not what I'm up here to do. I'm up here to talk to you about ways to be successful with what you could be doing, what you are doing, and how I could potentially help you do all of that along the way, regardless if there's a tool involved, a solution involved, or not. So that's what we're going to be breaking into, and we're going to look at it from the identity perspective. And the reason why we're going to do this, and this isn't new news to anybody. I'm not going to try to give you some grandiose methodology here. This is something that we all just have to kind of level set on, and with what zero trust is and why we're trying to do this, is that the attack surface has changed. Should be evident to everyone. The attack surface is growing. The blast radius of what could occur and what could happen when someone is breached is getting larger and larger. It's getting more expensive. And there's things that are changing in the space right now. And frankly, the way that we used to do things just doesn't work. Now, yes, there's still zero-day issues. There's vulnerabilities. There's people hacking in and doing those things. But if you look at the breaches that have occurred globally the last couple of years, the vast majority are exploiting identities, exploiting people and the way that they do their processes, their secrets, their credentials. People are becoming the weak link in this entire chain. Now, I'm not saying those other things don't exist, but the reality is, and the coin that Gartner likes to say that I like to repeat, is it's easier to log in than hack in today. So it's going to be easier for me to obtain your identity and move into your environment using your identity than it's going to be to try to exploit a vulnerability or a weakness in your security posture as a whole. Still happens, but that's the shift that's occurring. And the reason that's occurring is because the cybersecurity domain landscape is also growing. And people are involved at every level of this. Your identities and your accesses, your permissions are involved at every level. Basically, to summarize, your permissions, your access are everywhere, and they're in everything, and they give you access to everything. So if you're going to exploit and try to have a larger blast radius of your attack, you're going to attack the weakest link, and you're going to get in and hope that they don't have a good identity program, and they don't have a good identity posture, and they haven't right-sized access, they haven't put in just-in-time provisioning, and all these ways that they could eliminate that blast radius. So all that being said, I'm just trying to level set to just say the perimeter doesn't work anymore. Again, this isn't new information. This is something you've heard year over year now, probably for the last 5 years. But the reality is it's because the human, the person, is the weakest link. The identities tied to that individual are the weakest link. And then we look at expanding that understanding, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, when you get into machine identities and non-human identities, the non-carbon-based life forms that have access in your environment, they're all going to be tied back to a person who's going to open the door to allow those to be exploited. That's what is happening right now. Every phishing attack, every ransomware attack, everything you see is tying back to an individual who either did not properly follow process or was following process, but there wasn't the proper controls around their access. And we always talk about insider threats, and we always talk about, someone who's devious in the organization, but most of these are not necessarily an individual trying to do something nefarious. It's someone who's taken their access and used it in a nefarious way, even without their knowing. And that's really where kind of zero trust comes in. And I'll talk about that here in a moment, because this is an issue that we need to solve. We need to collectively come together and realize this is not a technology problem. This is a systemic problem that we have with people and process. The technology and the tooling is just that. It's tooling and technology that allows us to address these issues. But if we don't look at it that way, we go after the tool first, we go after the solution first, or try to add in a new product, we're not fixing the systemic issue that we're having in our environments. So the concept of zero trust, and this is where I will differ probably with a lot of the vendors here that are talking about zero trust. They're trying to sell you a product. Zero trust, just to be clear, is not a product. It is not a thing. It is not a thing you can buy. It is not a thing you can put in. It's a methodology and an approach. And I took this particular one from the NSA. This is a document produced earlier this year. If you would like a copy of the NSA document this is taken from, just contact me after the talk and we can get that to you. But the reality is zero trust is broken into many pillars. It's a paradigm and an approach. And yes, there's product and tooling in each of those pillars, but what ends up happening is you'll go after a particular product and say, well, I'm going to tackle device management. I'm going to tackle user management, and I'm going to get this tool to come in. But what you're doing is building a silo unintentionally that's going to keep you from leveraging true identity security throughout your entire identity fabric, which is a concept I'm not necessarily going to cover in this talk, but I hold entire workshops on the identity fabric and how to be successful with that. But the reality is you can't look at this particular layout of zero trust and say, I'm going to buy a product to fix this, because that's just not going to happen. If a vendor is telling you, I do end-to-end zero trust with product A, they're just not being factual. They can do a piece of zero trust, but not end-to-end zero trust. A lot of times you'll go in and talk about zero trust network access. Well, we're really talking one pillar here, not end-to-end zero trust. So with that in mind, with the fact that this is a process, this is a journey, this is something that we need to put our plan and a strategy around to be successful with, there's not one particular process that's going to work for everyone. We have to come in and ask ourselves some really hard truths, some hard questions. What are we good at? What are we not good at? What methodology and approach is going to work for you? So over the last 20 years, I've worked in multiple different industries, and I can guarantee you each of those companies that I work with are just as unique as the people working within those companies. You have the same objectives and the same goals in mind. We follow similar frameworks, but the way that we get there is going to be different for every single company and every single organization. Because if you don't treat it with the uniqueness that it requires and build a strategy and a plan and an approach to reach all of those pillars across zero trust, you're just never going to get there. And if you have a particular methodology, that methodology is not going to work for every single company and every single organization, because the people within it are going to have unique processes, unique cultures, unique way of doing things. And I'm pretty sure we've always encountered where we're trying to introduce something new and people say, well, I've always done it this way, or I've always done it that way, or what's the value in this and what's the value in that? You get this pushback. But the reality is we need to put together a strategy that you can be successful with. We need to put together a strategy that you can be truly innovative and come into your organization and try to get you to a level where you can be that next forefront leader in your organization. And the reality is, a lot of times we need to go all the way back to the person. We need to go all the way back to the identity. We provide a similar framework that you saw earlier from the NSA, but we simplify it and focus on identity, focus on security posturing, and secure networking. Now, the reason why I'm going to highlight identity here today is that I truly believe that we can do security posturing appropriately, we can do secure networking appropriately, but as long as we don't do identity appropriately, those other two don't matter as much. Because as soon as I get access, I can walk right in that door and my blast radius can be as large as my access is. I don't care how many bars you put on the windows, how many locks you put on the doors. If you have a user that's going to open them anyway, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter as much, I should say. So we're going to go back and we're going to talk about why identity is such an important piece of this. Because again, this is a journey, this is an approach. And I will add that I'm going to be talking about this again from the identity perspective, but if you and your organization feel you have a good handle of the identity side, you need to work on that security posturing, you need to work on that networking side, you're already beyond most organizations at that point. And I'd like to have a conversation with you about what those next steps actually look like. Because a lot of people say, well, I bought an IGA tool, or I bought a PAM tool, or I bought an access management tool, so I do identity. Well, the reality is more than likely you do a piece of identity. You do a portion of identity. And unfortunately, a lot of folks focus on just the human aspect of this. And yes, the human is the weak link, but again, they're tied to machine identities. They're tied to non-carbon-based life forms that have this access. So we have to look at the entire spectrum, the entire gambit. And the reality is, everyone talks least privilege, but I've never seen an organization truly do least privilege appropriately. They do it in pieces and they do it in pockets. You talk about role-based access controls and attribute-based access controls, policy-based access controls, and we come into an organization and they're doing a piece of that in a particular group or with a particular team. It's not as spread in the organization as it needs to be. So the concept of least privilege is the foundation of zero trust. Trust no one, always verify. Make sure they have the right level of access when they need that access. But the reality is that never comes to fruition. The other one here that is really a linchpin is the ownership and accountability. Ownership of your accounts, ownership of your processes, ownership of your solutions that you have in the environment is one thing. The accountability is where everyone falters. If you're able, and I haven't seen an organization that has true inventory of ownership across the organization of who owns what account, what process, what asset. You can put everything into your ITSM product. You can have your CI, your configuration items and all that documented. You can have your certification processes documented and followed, but there's always going to be a portion of accounts and assets in your environment that you're not going to be aware of if you're not truly doing some sort of detection and evaluation and discovery in your environment. Once you discover everything, you still have the question of who's responsible for these things. So I'm just giving you that as just a tidbit of an example of how big of an issue identity can be in your organization. It truly is coming down to ensuring that not only people have the right access at the right time for the right reasons and the right purposes, but it's who's responsible for all of this. Because we're going to talk about here in a second what this really means. It's not just the ability to detect and respond, but it's the ability to ensure that you're ready for when something happens, because something will happen. That's one of the concepts of zero trust. Zero trust is built on 7 different principles. One of those principles is assume you're already breached and there's already an issue. So prepare for that, ready yourselves for that. The reality is over 80% of all of these breaches that are occurring today are related to the identity. So that's a number that we should be taking seriously. Yes, you should, ensure that your security around your network is great. Yes, you should ensure that your security that you have within policies and procedures are great. But again, you need to ensure that the users, the people, those that are involved, those that are going to have the right impact, the negative impact, regardless of what the conversation is, truly understand what they're doing, which is a challenge all in itself. So we'll talk about that here in just a moment, because the reality is there's more than one kind of identity. So I don't want anyone drawing any conclusion that if I'm talking identity, I'm talking you as a person, as a carbon-based life form, walking and breathing, that you are the only thing that has access in the environment. The reality is access is everywhere, and it's in everything. I can't count. It's about 1 to 10 ratio to machine identities. So look about how many people are in your organization, times that at least by 10. Sometimes by 20, sometimes even by 100, depending on what kind of industry you're in. That's how many machine identities you have in your environment that have either just as much access as you do, more access, or access that's simply unchecked and we don't even know. And that's a big issue just in itself, is that discovery and awareness of who has access to what and what they're doing, what their behavior is, what their structure is. And we're not just talking internal users, we're talking third parties, we're talking your consultants that you bring in, we're talking people that just visit you on a weekend that need badge access. I mean, we have to look at the entire gambit of who you're letting in your organization, when you're letting them in, why you're letting them in, and have proper access controls end to end. Because all it takes is one person to open that locked door that you just put multi-factor on, or you just put some sort of multiple challenge step through that you have to verify. Once they're in, they're in. When they're in there, what level of access do they have? How are we tracking their access? Is that access appropriate? Do they even know the level of access they have? One of the biggest issues with CIM, or Cloud Infrastructure Entitlements Management, which is another piece of the identity structure within Zero Trust, is to go out and discover what all someone has access to and understand what we call the path to privilege. How do they have that privilege? How do they obtain that privilege? I've seen multiple organizations that go ahead and give a group an entitlement that provides access to a dev cloud environment. But because of the inheritance and the path to privilege, that inheritance gave them access to production environments with production data where all they believed was access to a dev environment. Do we have that understanding? I would say 99% of organizations simply do not. And that's a big issue. So we need to take our steps back, go ahead and understand that path to privilege, understand who has access to what they're doing with that access, and then put in proper controls to ensure that that access stays in check. Not only from a human perspective, but from a machine perspective. And this is kind of a rough diagram to kind of show the inner workings of identity and the pillars of identity. If I were to really show you kind of the architectural design of all this, it would be much larger and much more complex. But the reality is we need to ensure we have proper IGA controls, proper access management controls, proper PAM controls, proper KIM controls. We need to ensure that we're tying things into our directory services appropriately. And yes, we have a box we could double click on here when it comes to your security controls, the security tools, your SOC, all the above. But if I were to just zoom in on the pillars of identity, this is really what this would look like at a very, very high level. So keep in mind, there's a lot of complexity behind this diagram, but the grand scheme of things, we need to ensure that these work with each other. I work with a lot of PAM vendors, work with a lot of IGA vendors, KIM vendors, and the reality is they try to sell you on their pillar, and that's great, but you as an organization need to take the responsibility of saying, how does that particular product play in my overall portfolio? How does that set us on a path and a journey to truly reach zero trust? Am I going to also need to supplement in IGA capabilities? Am I going to also need to supplement in KIM capabilities, et cetera? So that's what we do. We come in and we try to make sure you understand the challenges of all this. You understand that this is a much bigger picture. So up to this point, the only thing I really hope you take away of this is a bigger picture. And if you truly think you have this under control, I hope you really do, because most of the time when we have a conversation and we start digging into your environment, start asking questions, the reality is you have a part of it under control, more than likely. There's pieces of this that simply are left to the wayside. And it's not that you're intentionally doing that, it's just that your priorities, your complexity, everything that's on your plate keep you and prevent you from doing a lot of this. Because the reality is the enterprise as a whole, your organization as a whole, they would want you to secure everything and anything that you can, but how many times have you struggled to get budget, or there's a change of priority, or there's a change of approach, new leadership comes in and says, this is more important than this. And a lot of times organizations that I know that can keep their budget and keep that moving forward, they actually have someone in there who's designing that journey for them that can sell the rationale, the reason, and the payback, the return on investment of what you're trying to accomplish. And obviously that's not a guarantee you're going to keep your budget. That's not a guarantee you're going to move everything forward. But I can tell you, eight probably out of 10 times I've seen this happen where the budget has been killed or direction has been changed because they never had a solid strategy to sell the value of what they're doing. It just looks like another cog in the wheel, another operational process. And what value is that to the organization? If it's working, it's working. If you've got people that you need to hire to just push buttons versus automate something and make it more consistent and more secure, what's the more cost-effective way? I've seen leadership come in and do these things. So, make sure that you don't minimize what you're trying to do. You don't minimize your strategy, your approach. You have to kind of have the ability to sell this upward. And the other side of it, another challenge that occurs quite a bit, if you are going to go in this journey, and we are going to take you down this path, and we're going to talk to you about all the areas of identity that we can help you with, the term zero trust is a little misleading from that perspective, because it isn't that you're going to have an organization where you don't trust anyone's access. That's the goal, that's the mindset, but the reality is there's variations of trust throughout the entire organization. You're going to have users that are already going to have assumed access to something versus another thing. It's really right-sizing that access appropriately and challenging where you need to challenge. And through all of this, it's very tricky to do, but you need to make sure you don't break the respect that you have for your users. Again, humans are the weakest link in this. And if you start removing their access, I always say, especially privileged users, IT users, nothing against anyone in here who has privileged access, but a lot of times when we start to remove that privileged access, out comes a privileged attitude. And they're like, I need to keep it. What are you doing? You're changing my job. Like, I can't do my job anymore. This is more clicks. So it's a methodology and it's a narrative that we need to spin around that. So we need to go with this zero trust mindset, but make sure we keep everyone's respect intact and make sure that that rationale and that story really tells what we're trying to accomplish and how they're part of it, how they're a piece of that. You're not trying to sidegate them. So the way that this really works, and I'm not going to ask you guys to kind of self-evaluate, but again, this is from the NSA. It's that document that I mentioned. I'm more than happy to share. It's public access, but I'll give you the link to it. Is most people are still in this preparation stage. You think that you're further along, and again, maybe you are, but if you don't do this stage right, if you don't understand your journey, if you don't understand what you're trying to accomplish, you don't have the rationale and the evidence of why you need to do it, you don't have the story and the narrative to tell what you're going to get out of it, what that return on investment is, you're not going to be able to move through these levels of maturity. I've seen many organizations think that they're here in the blue. I would say most organizations probably think they're in the blue when we start talking. The reality is they're kind of somewhere between the red and the orange here. They've got some plans, some strategy, they've implemented some stuff, but the big picture isn't there. That holistic vision isn't there. And again, what happens? Leadership changes, directions change, priority changes, funding disappears, and now you're stuck. You're stuck with what you have. 10 years from now, you'll have a team of people just kind of living what you've already created instead of moving it over that hump. So the concept of starting with identity within Zero Trust is to kind of get you over that hump. Understand who has access to what has access to what, get you to a level that you truly understand what's going on in your environment and build that strategy and plan to allow you to move across all the pillars of Zero Trust. Can you technically start other places? Yes. But the reality is the rate of success we have seen, starting with identity, is truly like it's probably a 1 to 10 ratio. If I'm just kind of making up ratios, which is what most talks are all about, right? Making up statistics. But the reality is we're assuming a breach. We're assuming something's already going to happen. We have to prepare ourselves for it. We have to make sure that we verify consistently. This is stuff that you guys know. I know these are the things that people say all the time about Zero Trust. But the reality is this is what we strive for in phase one, right? This is what people talk about, but they don't talk about what comes after that. And if you really look, what comes after that is planning, communication, making sure that we're vigilant, and making sure that we do regular assessments. I know how many times I've gone into an organization, we did an assessment 5 years ago. Like we knew where we were. So that's where we are today, right? Well, maybe part of it, but the reality is this needs to be continual. This isn't a one and done thing. The concept of Zero Trust is, again, a mindset and a paradigm that you're going to have to put into your DNA of your organization and make sure that it's something that is continually evolving and continually growing. So then we move on to kind of that design phase, that phase where the reality is we're now architecting a solution. We're building out that roadmap. We're building out that strategy of how you're going to obtain all of this. So taking it all the way back, what we need to do, if I just had to simplify all of this, make sure you understand where your current state truly is. Do a state of the union assessment. Know where your maturity is. Know where your gaps are. Know where your vulnerabilities in your process chain. And make sure it's very clear, your process chain, not your technology portfolio, your process chain, because that's what's going to affect the organization. So when you change process, you're affecting people. When you affect people, that's when the uproar happens. If you have to understand that if you go back 10 years ago, it was very common in cybersecurity to say convenience and security don't mix. They're oil and water. The reality is today, to make this accomplished, you have to mix them. You have to make security convenient because people are people and they will find every way around it, even if it's technically more work because they don't want to do it because it wasn't convenient for them. They weren't involved in the story. They weren't involved in the project narrative. And that's what we can come in and help with. So the reality is, how do we introduce all of this and make it as frictionless as possible? Because you're always going to get someone who's going to complain, but you don't want the entire organization complaining at the same time because that's where the noise comes in, that's when your project gets stalled, that's where you have bigger issues. And it can't just be the CISO says, do it, here's the policy, do it. That's great, but people are going to find a way around that if they can. So to kind of bring this to somewhat of a close, we have this cybersecurity life cycle that we like to talk about. And if you're familiar with NIST, I use NIST all the time. I do assessments against NIST. So this is going to look very familiar. But to actually do the cybersecurity life cycle, we have to introduce this kind of repeating approach where we're identifying, protecting, detecting, respond, recover, and review. And I can tell you where most people fail is the identifying and the review part. They're going to find something to protect against because they found an issue in the environment. They're going to respond a knee-jerk reaction to something. They're going to try to recover from whatever just occurred. But they're going to do these kind of out of order because they don't have a plan and strategy. Because the piece that's really missing around all of this, and I don't know if you've read the new NIST CSF 2.0 where it introduced governance. Governance is kind of the glue around all of this. But the reality is, I'd like to say if you were doing this appropriately, what you're really trying to do is create readiness in your environment. You have to assume a breach. You have to assume something's going to go wrong. You have to be able to respond to that, and you have to be ready to respond to that. And if you're getting yourself to that level, you're hitting that first pillar, that first series of principles within Zero Trust. So, again, I just want to just make sure it's understood. You know, a holistic, integrated approach is what's needed. Hopefully that little bit is clear enough, hopefully after this conversation, that you need to have that holistic view. Again, I'm not saying anyone can't help you. In particular, you probably have great people in your organization, but you really do need to bring people to the table that have done this successfully before. There's time and time again, people internally will try to say the same message. It just takes an outsider to say that same message a different way, and sometimes it resonates with leadership. It's just what happens. Now, that being said, I don't know how much time we have left. I think we're pretty close on time. I want to make sure I invite everyone to our booth. It's just a straight line shot on the other side of the expo hall. And I think everyone got a chocolate bar when they came in. Inside that chocolate bar could potentially be a golden ticket. If you have this golden ticket, I don't know how many are out there, but if you come visit our booth with the ticket, you'll have a little extra surprise, I believe, at our booth. So, on that note, I'll go ahead and end it and call it a day. Thank you.